Hi everyone. So we wanted to do a talk today about UCI legal time trial positioning. This is a question that we end up dealing with quite a lot within our appointments. Within Sweden, particularly that all of the Swede Cup type events are UCI sanctioned races. So the positions we're trying to set people into have to fit within a long list of rules that the UCI sets. So the technical regulation book, I think, is about 55 pages long. So we'll try and summarise the key parts that you actually need to know, and talk about the position of the bike that you have to actually set up. Most of that is basically accredited as soon as you have the little UCI sticker on your frame. Shows that the frame has adhered to most of the rules within that book. But it's still possible for the position that you put onto the bike to then not be UCI legal. So when we're talking about a UCI legal position, it's all kind of centering around this bottom bracket position. So where the cranks go through the frame, that's our origin point for a lot of this measurement. And the first one we look at with regards to that is where the saddle is positioned. So within the saddle height, that is not an issue at all. That can kind of go to wherever it wants to be, but it can't go too far forwards in essence. So the original rule is generally it has to be at least 50 millimeters or 5 centimeters behind the bottom bracket, so in a horizontal plane. So if you go a vertical line straight up from the bottom bracket, you have to go at least 5 centimeters back to reach the furthest forwards point on the saddle. Within some situations, you can actually go forwards to 0, but we'll talk about that in a little moment. We'll talk briefly about the saddle before we move on to that, because the saddle itself is also important. There are some rules around how the saddle itself can be, and again, most saddles will be UCI compliant, but it's still something to be aware of. That the saddle, for example, it can't be shorter than 240 mm long, can't be longer than 300 mm long, and also the inclination of the saddle from the highest point to the lowest point can't be more than 9 degrees, and that's the lowest point on the top of the saddle, not anything underneath. So the angle of the saddle, for most people, it's not going to be over 9 degrees, but it's possible to be outside of the UCI regulations if you angle the saddle down by some crazy angle. So keeping it relatively flat, and you'll be absolutely fine. But back towards the setback situation. So like I say, generally the standard rule is 5 centimeters there, but you can go forwards to 0. For morphological exemptions is what they class it as. So generally the reason for that is you don't necessarily need to be too aware of, but all you need to know is that you can, if you want to, go forwards to 0, but it then affects what you can do with the handlebar positioning as a result. Because the handlebars from the bottom bracket to the furthest forwards point of the shifter, so the very end point of your TT extension, that can't be more than 750 millimeters normally. But again, you can go up to 800, but not if you've used the 0 on the bottom bracket. So this is where it gets a little bit kind of confusing with mixing and matching. But in short, if you want to use the extra reach to the handlebar, you have to put the saddle back to 5 centimeters. If you want to go forwards to 0 with the saddle, you can't go more than 750 with the handlebars. But you can use an exemption for one of those two things. So either you get to use the 800 or the 0, but not both. So yeah, in short, you can either go further forwards with the front and further back with the back, or everything comes closer towards each other. So for taller riders, generally you'll want to kind of use that extra 50 that you get at the front of the bike and move the bars further away. But that means the saddle is going to have to be further backwards. And for shorter riders, we'll sometimes want the saddle to come further forwards to prevent their hips becoming too close at the top of the pedal stroke. But then they are also going to be constrained by the handlebars not being able to go more than 750 in front of the bottom bracket. There are, just to be even more confusing, some extra exemptions to this. If you're over 1.90 m, the reach on the handlebar actually goes up by 5 centimeters. So you can go up to 850 if you're over 1.90 m tall. So if you're exactly 190, that's a good place to be. That means you get an extra 5 centimeters height over someone that's 189, for example. So yeah, an odd ruling, but that is how that works, unfortunately. The last rule in terms of positioning that you need to be kind of conscious of, though, is with regards to the drop from the end of the shifter to the centre of the arm pad. So the vertical distance between this point here and that point there. because this is a thing that a lot of positions over the years and now is becoming really popular. Triathlon, for example, is starting to kind of go quite high with this angle and creating a huge drop from there to there in this kind of higher hand position. For a lot of UCI setups, that's not easy to do. There are ways around this in some ways. So if you look at Filippo Garner, for example, where his arm pad's kind of like halfway up his arm so that he can have a big angle for his forearm. Most people wouldn't advise that though. It's not a particularly stable position, not particularly easy to ride. He's a fairly extreme example of someone that's quite good at riding a bike apparently. In general, we're trying to basically keep though less than 100 millimeters of height from the end of this to the center of there, and that includes your shifter as well. So with the shifter, if you have a mechanical shifter, it would be in its most vertical position. So if you had the shifter kind of pointing upwards, it would be its highest point that you have to measure from there down to the arm pad. And then when we're measuring the reach, it would also be from the end of the shifter, which would then have to be in its most horizontal position, so it's further forwards position to measure backwards to the bottom bracket. So in this regard, it's actually quite a lot of an advantage to look at electronic shifting because the shifters don't move and that position is fixed in place. And even with things like the new axis where we can have the shifters underneath, then they're not involved in that measurement at all. You're only measuring the extension itself. But as long as you stick within those three things and your frame has a sticker on, then when you turn up at the start of the race, then you should be all good to go. If you have any questions on this specifically, or if you want to talk about how to set your bike up, please just let us know.